Welcome everybody to this slightly delayed conversation with Finn Duff. We attempted to have this conversation yesterday on Tuesday for LinkedIn Live, but we had a few technical issues, so we've come back today to record this conversation so we can share it with you. Before we go into the conversation though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I broadcast from today, which is the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And Finn, whose lands are you broadcasting from today?
The Wurundjeri people.
Oh, fantastic. So, and of course, acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands on which all of you might be watching this conversation on today. Now, we're going to have a conversation today about gender, and it's something that I've been really looking forward to because it's quite a switch in gears for this practical inclusion series that I'm doing. We've talked a lot about, some nitty-gritty details about workplace inclusion, and we're still going to do that. But today I thought there would be value in just having a conversation with somebody who has a lived experience of being trans, and a young person at that. I'm regularly hearing in training that I do that there is no need for LGBTIQA plus inclusion training anymore. And I've spoken about this on my social media, and of course I disagree. I think it's needed now as much as ever. But the way we need to raise people's understanding and awareness of that, I believe, is through stories. And so that's what we're going to do today is have a good chat with Finn. So Finn, thank you so much for coming and having this conversation. Can you maybe start just by telling us a little bit about who you are, where you're at? You're 18, I believe. So where you're at and a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm 19.
19.
I graduated high school last year, and instead of going straight into uni, I decided to do a gap year. I knew I wanted to work with kids, especially LGBT kids, but I didn't exactly know how. So I've kind of taken this year to think things over, and I now volunteer with Minus 18 at their youth events when events still took place in real life. And I'm hoping to kind of just broaden my horizons in the future and work with mental health professionals and in inclusion areas. So that's where I'm at right now.
That really impresses me. And I think back, when I was 19, I was certainly very focused on myself, and not as certainly nowhere near where you are, where you're pretty clear in what you want to do, in that you want to really help people, and you are helping young LGBTIQA plus people. What generated that? Like, where did that come from, that want to give back in that way?
So during high school, I was the unofficial leader of the school's GSA group, Pride group, and I really, really appreciated the people that reached out after I graduated and towards the end of my time in high school that said, you've really made me open up and accept myself, and I made people feel like they had a place to belong. And just that feeling of like that people looked up to me was just really fulfilling. And I was like, maybe I'd become a youth worker or a teacher and stuff like that to kind of do more of that and bring more joy to people.
That's so beautiful. So clearly a leader then in your own way at a young age. Tell us a little bit, so before we go further into that, tell us a little bit about your journey with gender, and how you've come to be someone who LGBT kids are looking up to.
Yeah, so I've always, growing up, I would always be labelled a tomboy, and someone, that wasn't afraid to get rough, I guess. And then I didn't really think much of it until I was about 14, and the internet really kind of became very accessible to me. And I kind of started to realize that there were other people like me who are a little bit different out there, and that I wasn't quite alone as I thought, although I felt very isolated. I didn't know anyone else going through something like this. And it took probably about 5 years of me slowly realizing that I was in fact a trans man, and that I wanted to, you know, fully transition after high school and as I got older. So yeah, and then as I grew up, I saw more representation, and I met different people and realized that, like, who I was, I guess, and yeah, became a fully formed person.
It's so interesting to hear, and I know many people who will be listening, perhaps of my generation, to hear that, you know, that's where you went. You found out information about yourself from the internet, and how, I guess, the doors that's opened up for so many young people. Is that where you hear that most of the young people you're working with find out, you know, more about themselves and start to explore what their identity is?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few people I've come across, just in all aspects of life, younger people that I'm talking to, and they've definitely found a real sense of who they are through the internet. And I mean, life is a journey, and you know, you might feel like one label fits at some point and then it doesn't fit anymore a couple of years later, and that journey of self-expression and like finding yourself, the internet really helps. It also can be harmful as well, but it definitely makes things a lot easier, especially when, you know, I mean, I went to school at a very strict school, which didn't allow for much self-expression. So finding people that were like me was made a little bit more difficult. So yeah, just being online helps a lot.
Yeah, fantastic. And gosh, this is bringing up so much for me as well, being someone who, when I was at school, I didn't quite fit in terms of my gender representation either. And thinking through that and how you found that information on the internet, did you also find, you kind of alluded to it, did you also find community there, or did that come in other ways?
I think for me personally, it probably came out more in real life. I was never the kind of person that sought out, I guess, internet friends, just because I'm bad at keeping in touch and I found it difficult. But I definitely, over the years, as my friendship circle grew and stuff, I started to notice that most people were some sort of queer identity, you know, and I kind of was attracted to these individuals that ended up identifying with the LGBT community. And we just kind of like stuck together and found each other, I guess.
And that, you know, that's kind of that idea of community. And for people who aren't LGBTI, can you maybe explain why that's so important, why that was so important to kind of, you know, find people who were like yourself?
I think it's always important, like, to know that you're not alone, I guess, and you could be filled with a room full of people, but if they're not experiencing very, very similar things to what you've experienced, it's hard to relate on a really deep level and know that they truly understand what you've gone through and that they'll be there for you. And I think that it's really important to have a community that you can come into a place and just feel like at ease, and that you don't have to put up a wall, and you can just kind of really be yourself without the expectation that someone might shut you down. I think that's really vital.
That's powerful, the way you've articulated that. And for me, working in diversity and inclusion, the ultimate goal is to create that sense of ease and that space in all places, right? That's what we're striving to achieve. And so it's a little conflicting, because I see with you and have experienced the value of community and people like you, but I also work constantly to break those barriers down and create, you know, a more broader inclusive community. And Do you think, and I don't know, maybe this is getting a bit philosophical, but do you see that there could be a time where there's perhaps not that need as much to have that community of people who are like you, and that you would potentially feel that sense of ease in more broader mainstream society?
Yeah, I think so, to an extent. I feel like it is really nice to have people that, have come from a different walk of life or don't identify the same as you, that can appreciate your existence really and understand where you're coming from. But at the same time, I think there's kind of always going to be this safety in numbers mentality that people have just as humans. And, it just will always feel more comfortable to speak to someone that really you can connect with in such a deep way. Like, I have friends that are straight and they don't understand exactly what I'm going through all the time, and it makes it difficult. It feels sometimes like there's this barrier because they haven't had this knowledge that I've got. And I think it would be nice for everyone to understand and be educated more. So yeah, I feel like that is a goal.
Yeah, cool. That's why we keep doing this stuff, right? Right, I wanted to ask you a little bit about transitioning. So not in terms of any details about that, but in terms of the types of challenges you had perhaps during while you were transitioning, and maybe a bit about the positive signs of support that you received and the things that did make you feel included and empowered to be going through that.
Well, so I, right before I turned 18 last year, I knew that I was going to, as soon as I was an adult, I was going to begin to transition, I guess. On my 18th birthday, I shaved my head in a very defiant act, I guess, and began to wear pants to school, which was a really big deal. I think I was probably the first girl to do so. But I still wasn't out. I just began to do things for myself, and I really did take it as a very personal journey. And I was like, I don't need anyone's help. I can do this all myself. And took a lot on just by myself. And that did get really, really difficult. And it was so much easier after I came out, and there was just all these people that wanted to support me in every way they knew how. And I realized that I didn't have to go through things too much alone, as I originally thought, which was fantastic. And I'm still going through my transition and becoming the person I want to be, which is fantastic. And I have the support of others along the way. And they don't always understand what's going on or know how to help, but they want to. And that's what's important, I think.
Yeah, wonderful. Can you tell us you told me about how you actually came out. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so it was a year in the making. I took a lot of time. I had like a whole journal planned out of all these ideas of how I was going to do it, because I'm a very dramatic and theatrical person. So I don't like serious conversations. And after confiding in a couple close friends over the span of a year, I decided after I graduated, I would write a letter to my parents, detailing what I was going through and where I was coming from with all this, and how it wasn't a surprise if you looked at the clues. And I quoted Rent in it. It was very interesting. And I left it in the car, and I went away for the weekend on schoolies. And I sent a text to my mum and said, I've left something in the glove compartment, like, check it out. And then I turned off my phone for a bit. I couldn't deal with whatever was about to happen. And then, I got messages back, and my mum and my dad were very, very supportive of me, and they thanked me for opening up. And then the next day, after a lot of deliberation, I came out very publicly to everyone that I've ever known on Facebook. It was quite a bold move for me, and I had a little bit of regret. I think, I did it at about 1 a.m. and I was just so overwhelmed. I went for a walk around the neighborhood, and I just had so many thoughts, you know, because I knew that everything was going to change after that. And it did, but for the better, I think. And I just took that leap and hoped for the best.
Wow. And how, maybe carrying on from that then, now, how different do you feel now that you've come out and you've got through that kind of initial coming out phase?
I feel just better about myself. I was really, really anxious for, I think probably, you know, I had feelings of anxiety and depression, especially after I started to realize, you know, who I was becoming, and couldn't necessarily do much about it, you know, and didn't want to share that with anyone at that moment. And it did really feel like a weight had been lifted, and to know that so many people still loved me and wanted to be around me and stuff was just the best feeling ever. I just felt so, I guess, loved, which was lovely. And that I didn't have to be necessarily ashamed of who I was. You know, I started this year at Pride, I was volunteering with Minus 18, and I was able to post photos, you know, of me enjoying the atmosphere and not have to worry about what people thought and stuff. So yeah, I just felt more authentic, I think.
Yeah, so well articulated. That's, you know, and it's so heartwarming to hear your story. I'm sure people are going to absolutely love to hear that. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and you know, you've shared what is, you know, a quite positive coming out story. But I have a lot of people who come through my training or might contact me through social media and voice opinions that they feel that there's absolutely no need anymore for LGBTI inclusion work, and you know, same-sex marriages happen and everything's okay. What do you see maybe with the kids that you work with and with people you know as to whether you believe we still need to do this work or not?
I think it's still quite vital. I mean, there might not be, you know, hate crimes happening every day on the regular that you experience, but it's definitely still these microaggressions that people have to go through and just put up with, I guess, on a daily basis. And, you know, they might not necessarily be coming from a place of anger or something. These people don't necessarily know that they're being rude or, you know, homophobic or whatever. It's just ingrained within them, and it's just the way that society has taught them to behave. And so I think that there's still quite a need for kind of breaking down like what these actions mean and how they negatively affect people, and how we can kind of overcome that and just be more inclusive and respectful.
That's my new promo. That's perfect. And you know, microaggressions 100%, that's what really drives me too, is that it's not necessarily that people are intentionally hurtful. There certainly are still a lot of those people out there, but it's the fact that there isn't enough awareness and education, and we have been raised and continue to be raised in a society that is incredibly rigid around gender and gender stereotypes, and that plays out in the way we do respond to people who are gender diverse. And yeah, there's still plenty of work to be done to break that down. So definitely want to use that as some promo material to get this message out there more. I did kind of want to, you know, this series is called Practical Inclusion, and I did want us to talk a little bit about practical things that you think people can do to create inclusion and to really assist young people who are going through perhaps something like yourself, or something quite different. Maybe you know, now you're with Minus 18, but and you kind of entered that workplace, but soon you might enter a workplace full time as well. What would you like to see people do that are, you know, that help them be practical allies? Like, what types of things would you like to see?
Something that is definitely becoming more prevalent, it's not, you know, completely unseen, but the normalization of just asking people's pronouns and having, you know, name tags or whatever that include people's pronouns, and just kind of making that a regular thing, I think is quite important. And it just kind of reassures someone that is gender diverse that that they'll be accepted, and, you know, for however they choose to present. Another thing is, I'm currently unemployed for the most part, and applying for jobs I find really difficult. If they don't state, I mean, if they do state that they're very inclusive, it makes it feel like they have to reach a target for diversity, and they have to have a certain number of people that are diverse to meet a quota. But if they don't, I feel like, you know, what am I walking into? Am I going to be safe? You know, how are these people going to treat me? And it makes it quite difficult to choose employment, I guess, and make sure that I'm respected in the workplace.
That is spot on. So it's trying to understand whether an organisation is not tokenistic in its approach to diversity. And the word you used there was safety, and I think some people forget that that is still actually a core concern for people at LGBTIQA+, that we're actually safe in a workplace, and how organisations can demonstrate that message. What do you think would make you feel that place was safe, or you feel like you just can't really get that kind of indication at the moment?
Yeah, it's difficult, I mean, to gauge. Yeah, I don't know. I think it would definitely have to be, you know, in an interview, just acknowledging people come from different backgrounds and have different life experiences, and just stating that, you know, they're there for you, and you know, maybe that they have support systems that, if you're going to work for the company, that you have access to, and things like that, just to make sure that it's not impersonal, and you know, you're kind of just valued, I guess. And that kind of makes you feel like, okay, well, if that's the way that the company works, and the employees should have those values as well, and that kind of creates an environment that you'd want to be in.
Yeah, I just don't understand how you have this such insight into stuff that some of us have taken years to try and work out. But yeah, absolutely. You know, if I often say, because people do ask me at times, you know, what should they be looking for to see that an organisation is truly inclusive? And I think you've nailed it. It's yes, you want to see inclusion in their values, and you want that to be actively and proactively spoken about, particularly at interview for sure. But you want to see also long-term commitment and demonstrations. You want to see policies where LGBTIQA plus people are actually written into the policies, and then you want to see evidence that they're actually enacted. And I think I often tell people, you know, check out Google and see what types of things come up for the organisation that are around LGBTI inclusion, and if they're all just pictures of them collecting awards, or, you know, getting ticks, or there's, you know, a one-off day where they're all wearing a purple t-shirt, that's a good start. But you want to see more than that. You want to see that they're actually engaging in conversations on these issues, and you know, and that it is written into their strategy and their policies, and there's been a long-term commitment. I think that's when you would feel the safest walking into a workplace. But yeah, you can't always be 100% sure, but there are more signs that you can see that are visible to people external to an organisation. Well, I think there are just so many gems that have come from this conversation. I again want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story, because I know how confronting that can be at times, and it's just so valuable for people to be able to hear other people's stories. And we know, you know, there's excellent research to show that one of the ways you create diversity champions and get people to be inclusive and demonstrate inclusion more broadly is to expose them to people from different backgrounds to themselves, who have had different lived experience. And so the more stories we can get out there, the better. Next week, so thank you very much, Finn, for coming on.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. So next week, I'm going to get in a former colleague of mine, and we're going to talk about this same topic, but from a more specific workplace inclusion lens. So join in then Tuesday at noon on LinkedIn, because I think it'll be a really nice tie-in end to this type of conversation. Also, I did mention briefly yesterday, for those who saw the false start, that Joe Bangles and I have now launched our online course that accompanies our live linked out program. It's a 2-hour LGBTIQA plus inclusion online course. I think it's going to be wonderful for people who are already allies, people who really want to be and haven't quite got there yet, but also for people who do identify as LGBTIQA plus. You know, we're always allies of other members of our community, and so the more that we can learn, the better to create inclusion. We're really proud of this. I really think it will have impact in workplaces. You can jump onto my website, www.breegorman.com.au/linked out, and you can get the link to the course there and enroll. It'd be wonderful to have you as part of that course and to provide us with feedback as to what you think about it and how we can improve it. So tuning out now, thank you for dealing with our false start, and Finn, you know, amazing that you managed to jump back on with me again and we could finish this conversation. I'm really happy about that. And I will catch everybody hopefully next week on Tuesday at noon.